you wrote a piece for Providence on the application of the just war tradition to the Ukraine conflict in recent weeks, and that resulted in a response from the editor of Providence, Mark Tooley, who's a great a thinker in his own right, and critiquing your piece, and then they allowed you to respond to Mark Tooley as well. And so one thing on the outset, I just applaud Providence for engaging in kind of open dialogue in their pages. I just don't think there's a lot of that going on these days. I think a lot of journalistic outlets or even scholarly outlets just don't allow open, honest dialogue to happen. Mm-hmm. And so I applaud Providence for doing that. And just one side note, one of my, I don't know if you call it a hobby horse, is I think people overlook the fact that the Christian church is one of the few places you can have this because they have the resources to have open dialogue. If you believe that there is a higher moral order that we are accountable to, then we want to get it right. And we want to challenge each other to get it right. And once you step outside of that framework, everything just becomes about power. And power would say, no, you don't allow people to have a platform on your platform. You don't engage them honestly. You dominate, you subdue, right? That's the world of power. And the Christian church and the Christian politics should not be about domination. It should be about dialogue. Should be about thinking carefully through these things. So I applaud Providence for that. I'm glad that you were engaged in this debate with Mark Tooley. And so with that introduction, so what was in your article? How did it relate to the Ukrainian issue? And let's get the ball rolling there.
Yeah, so I wrote the article actually engaging with another conversation that had been happening in Providence in the weeks prior, and that was a series of articles that were actually based on a series of talks hosted by the Institute for Religion and Democracy, wherein another scholar had proposed that we needed to expand the just war framework to something that he called just statecraft, which I think would be very intriguing for you, Darren, since you teach a course on statesmanship. I do. And the basic idea here was, how do we apply just war thinking across the entire domain of national power? So in the national security space and the foreign policy space, practitioners and scholars alike often refer to the DIME acronym, D-I-M-E, and they look at these as the four main categories of national power: diplomacy, information and intelligence, military, and economic. And basically the argument goes is that all four of these levers or domains of power are deployed by nation states to advance their foreign policy objectives. So, the discussion in Providence was, if just statecraft is essentially an expansion or an addition to just war theory and broadening its scope to include things beyond the immediate run-up and conduct of a war, but to how a state deploys its power even in peacetime. So I found that really interesting. And so when we had the now infamous Oval Office meltdown between President Vladimir Zelensky of Ukraine and President Donald Trump and Vice President J.D. Vance a few weeks ago, I felt like that would be a really good test case of this just statecraft proposition. And the reason I thought that was because, well, we had a war, the Ukraine war, but in that moment in the Oval Office, we didn't have necessarily a military component there because America is not a belligerent in this war, at least not in the traditional sense. We don't have boots on the ground. We are obviously backing Ukraine. We're sending a lot of weapons and munition, and we're sharing intelligence. We're assisting them in a host of other ways. In fact, we're assisting them in diplomacy, intelligence and information sharing, military aid, and in economic aid. We are assisting Ukraine across the whole DIME spectrum. And so I thought, well, this is a good test case, a good case study of what just statecraft as a framework could look like in assessing not just this moment of Ukraine-American relations, but also assessing even the President Trump's pitch for some kind of peace deal. So that was the first thing. I was thinking of engaging with that particular discussion, and looking at this particular moment as a relevant case study. But then the other component of it was that I found myself a little surprised by the vehemence with which the Trump administration was attacked for even suggesting that a peace deal or a ceasefire in Ukraine was possible. And the fact that they would be willing to pursue it to the extent of appearing to strong arm the Ukrainians into one. Now, admittedly, and we can get into like the particulars of this, the Oval Office meeting, the meltdown that occurred, what I've been at pains to tell people is those kinds of flare-ups occur regularly in diplomatic relations, even among friends and allies. The unique moment for this particular one was that it happened in front of a lot of cameras and millions of viewers. Right. And that's what made it feel unique. That's what made it feel like everything was coming apart and falling apart. And that's not entirely true, as events in the 2 weeks following that demonstrated. So I had two things I was trying to do. I was asking a question of like, is this a case study for just statecraft as a viable framework for understanding conflict and navigating conflict with wisdom and prudence? And how do we, like, why is there such a anger at even just the mere thought of suggesting, or even just asking a question, can we do a ceasefire and what would that look like? And so I found in just war theory that in the discussions around the American support for the Ukrainian war effort, I found that there'd been a lot of appeal to just war theory, rightfully so. It is a just war. I don't think you'll find anybody who will say it's not. It has a just cause. They've been invaded by an aggressor nation. This is like this is like the clearest cut example of what a legitimate just cause war looks like. Is you are invaded, you are attacked, right? Yeah. Like that's pretty legit. Yeah. And then you also have a legitimate authority declaring the war, the government of Ukraine. Like it's just completely valid. But what seemed to be a surprise to me was that the element of just war theory that was getting overlooked was probability of success, which, as I was listening to the arguments that Vice President Vance, President Trump were making, both to Zelensky, but also what they made to, like, just in their public discussion on the war, is they were essentially appealing to that part of the tradition. Now, they weren't saying it that way. They weren't saying, I doubt President Trump is a just war theorist in any way, shape, or form, but they were essentially making that acknowledgement, like, hey, we have to think about we have to think about whether or not there's a probability of success. Now, of course, success in what way? And their basic framework has been success as defined by Ukraine. So President Zelensky has generally defined success in the war as recapturing land lost to Russia and or significant security guarantees and or membership in NATO, the European Union, etc., all of which have been generally seen and stated by the Russians as non-starters on any peace agreement. So the position it seemed of Trump and Vance was, well, at this current rate at which we're supporting Ukraine, they're not able to progress towards their war aims. And it's the stated policy of the Biden administration and the Trump administration that Ukraine won't be going into NATO. So where do we go from here? Like, do we have probability of success under these terms? Their answer is no, we don't. And so we need to think about, at that point, we need to think about a diplomatic off-ramp here. And it really just seemed to be like they were making the opening argument for pursuing peace on the basis of not having a pathway towards a reasonable probability of success. To me, that seemed very straightforward. That seemed very commonsensical. And so I was a little surprised to see a major division open up among just general scholars in the field of foreign policy and international relations, but even just among Christian observers on this matter. And it really came down to, do we just continue to support Ukraine with just, open-ended military aid as is, or are we just abandoning them completely? It was really an all or nothing proposition, which I wasn't picking up in the policy and diplomacy discussion, but that really seemed to be kind of how the conversation polarized. And so I thought there really does need to be a reminder to people that, you could still lose a just war. And so that's
Right.
why you contemplate probability of success. And so we need to re-engage this piece of the discussion.
Yeah, so there has to be some prudential judgment as to how are you using your resources, how are you able to continue fighting, those kind of prudential judgments that once you cross the moral threshold, then there's some these type of judgments being made. So okay, so that makes sense. So the editor of Providence, Mark Tooley, had some concerns about this, I guess, and he wrote a response piece. So what were his concerns about your framework or the way you approach this?
I'll confess, when I first read his article, because he was responding not just to me, but to also to a article that
Rusty
similarly, out of First Things, that similarly, that made a similar appeal, I should just say. So he was responding to both of us, and when I first read it, I actually wasn't sure if he was responding to me at all, because I wasn't seeing the direct connections to my argument. But I think if I were to sum it up, I think he was basically arguing that just because a country could lose or has a low probability of success doesn't mean, under just war teaching, they should back down in the face of aggression. That just war teaching allows a smaller, weaker country to fight back against an aggressor, which I would thoroughly agree with. And he has a ton of historical examples of this.
Yeah.
A lot of good varied examples, I might add. And so I kind of generally saw that as somewhat non-responsive to the argument, but at the same time relevant, because it's a helpful way of allowing me to say, yeah, that's not what I'm saying at all. And this is, I think, is relevant for because for advocates of a peace deal, for American advocates who have generally backed the Trump administration's ceasefire deal, they generally do tend to fall into this category of, they'll say things like, Ukraine's one of the most corrupt countries in the world. Why are we supporting this? They're for sure going to get knocked around, and they're going to lose eventually. Why are we backing a loser? And I think that general view of Ukraine is absolutely wrong. It is wrong on multiple levels, and it's unjust. I mean, just because a country is smaller and weaker than the aggressor doesn't mean that they just give in and throw themselves down there. And then, two, the whole canard about Ukraine being a corrupt country does not at all account, there's no graciousness in that at all. There's no civility in it. It does not account for the fact that Ukraine is a country that has made huge strides in democratization and developing a liberal democracy. And they're making huge strides in a single generation after multiple generations of communist oppression. You cannot expect them to just immediately be a flourishing liberal democracy with total transparency and no corruption, et cetera, just one generation after multiple generations of communism. So